Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on socio-emotional learning and EdTech in a post-pandemic world. We'll give people a minute to start joining in. In the meantime, if you could type in the chat where you're signing in from, it'll be great to see where people are coming in from, and we'll just give it a minute before we get started. We've got people from Ghana, Tanzania, Jordan, Canada, Finland, London, India. Great. Thank you all for joining in. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Akanksha Bapna, and I am going to be your host for this afternoon. I'm a senior research fellow with the Edtech Hub and have spent a large chunk of the last decade thinking about socio-emotional learning, measuring them at large scale, and developing tools to think through these skills. I'll just quickly go over a couple of housekeeping points before we dive in. This webinar is being recorded, and we will be posting the recording on the Edtech Hub YouTube channel in case you'd like to have access to it afterwards. We will be having 3 panels, which I will go into detail in a little bit. We'll also be posting some relevant links throughout the whole webinar, so do keep a lookout for those. And the last point is that do feel free to pop in questions in the Q&A box. We will be collating them and presenting them to the panelists once the presentations are done. So we can dive right in. We have a pretty tightly packed schedule. Socio-emotional learning encompasses a wide range of skills, attitudes, and competencies which serve as strong determinants of an individual's well-being. Globally, the interest in developing SEL or life skills or socio-emotional learning or 21st century skills, and we won't go into the differences at the moment, has been on the rise over the last couple of decades. But since the pandemic started, there has been a much greater need to focus on life skills, and it's become a lot more immediate. In fact, we could even call them post-pandemic skills. What we will see in this post-pandemic set of skills is a shift in what we really need, particularly because the world is a lot more digitized very, very suddenly. And as the Edtech Hub, we are very interested in understanding what these skills are, and importantly, what role can technology play in the improvement and uptake of socio-emotional learning. So without much ado, we will jump right in. We have an exciting lineup for this afternoon. We have a 2.5-hour webinar, but we promise to hold your attention. We're starting off slightly broad and going more and more into the depth of life skills or socio-emotional skills and EdTech. So we will start off with a welcome by the Executive Director of the Edtech Hub, Verna Bihari, followed by the first discussion, which will talk about what skills we're looking at. When we're looking at this session, we're also looking at a very broad range from very specific implementation all the way to the policy level. We then start getting a little bit more specific, going into interventions that are looking at socio-emotional skills as well as EdTech. And finally, the last session will then discuss how SEL and EdTech interact, in light of when technology is used as a means, as an end, or as an assessment tool. So over to you, Verna. Verna Lal Bihari, Executive Director of the Edtech Hub.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Akanksha. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Again, my name is Verna Lal Bihari, and I serve as the Executive Director for the Edtech Hub. And I want to welcome you all today. Thank you so much for making the time to set aside to actually focus on a topic that is very important in not only a post-pandemic world, but also a pre-pandemic world, and for students and teachers and families writ large, social emotional learning in an EdTech post-pandemic world. As you can tell, our team has put together a very jam-packed session. Definitely, we hope that you stay with us throughout the session. I also want to very quickly just, for those of you who are not familiar with the EdTech Hub, let you know that we're a research partnership that is really dedicated to empowering decision makers with the evidence, the research, and the information that they need in order to make wise choices about the use of technology and education. As we think of social emotional learning and considering what I think of as the whole child, educational technology has the ability and the potential to enhance the opportunities we make available for both teachers and students. And I reference teachers because I think it's also important for us to consider the social emotional well-being of our classroom teachers, who we know have been put through the ringer over the past couple of years with regards to teaching during COVID. At the EdTech Hub, we're a consortium of five partners, and together we're a global team that is really focused on making sure we provide evidence of what works, for whom, and under what conditions. We focus on 6 different countries, so all low and middle income countries across the world: Kenya, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Ghana, Bangladesh, and Pakistan are our focus countries. And we also have a few focus topics that we dig deep in as well. I'm not going to eat up too much of your time, but definitely did not want to miss this opportunity to welcome you all to the webinar. I know that Akanksha and the team, the panelists and our partners have put together a very engaging 2 hours, and I encourage you to stay for the entire 2 hours and dig deep with the team as we unpack the social emotional learning in a post-pandemic world. Thank you all for being here today. Back to you, Akanksha.
Thanks a lot, Verna. I think we had a bit of a technical glitch. Right back here. So without much ado, we will dive right into the first panel, which will be moderated by Dr. Fiona Samuels. Fiona is a senior research fellow at ODI. Her work currently focuses on the intersection of health, poverty, risk, and vulnerability, with a particular interest in gender, adolescence, social protection, mental health, and psychosocial well-being. Fiona is also an honorary associate professor at the Faculty of Public Health and Policy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Fiona's recent work includes co-designing tools for psychosocial well-being at the intersection of EdTech and socio-emotional learning. She is also the PI of a program of work in Tanzania and Vietnam, which focuses on addressing the mental health and psychosocial well-being of adolescents through the co-creation and testing of digital and non-digital solutions. So over to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much, Akanksha, and thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this really interesting panel. So in this panel, as Akanksha alluded to at the beginning, we're going to be discussing the key SEL competencies that need to be developed in the digitally enhanced post-pandemic world, especially in low and middle income countries. So our speakers on this panel are Jennifer Sklar from the IRC, Shri Oberoi from the Akanksha Foundation in India, Dr. Ha-Yeon Kim from NYU, and Drona Bronwyn from the FCDO. I'm going to introduce them all in one go now, a bit more details, and then I'm going to hand over to them to speak, to do their presentations. Each of them will be speaking for 10 minutes. I'm going to be quite strict with that time. I've been told to warn you when you have 3 minutes left. So firstly, Jennifer Sklar is the Director of Education at the International Rescue Committee. For the past 2 decades, she has been working in international education as a practitioner and a technical expert in socio-emotional learning. Her work focuses on ensuring provision of education and enhancing educational outcomes in conflict-affected areas. Recently, she led the development of an EdTech strategy to support 8 countries as they deal with the school closures because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Following her is Shri Oberoi, who joins us from a deep grounding in socio-emotional learning. She's been leading the work of socio-emotional learning at the Akansha Foundation for several years. This foundation is a non-profit organization with the mission to build the largest network of innovative schools that empowers children to maximize their potential and influence systemic reform. For over 30 years, Akansha has educated children from low-income communities across the state of Maharashtra in India. It is one of the largest urban networks of public-private partnership schools in India. Shri brings in rich expertise in school development, socio-emotional learning, and project management. Following her, we have Dr. Ha-Yeon Kim, who is a senior research scientist at NYU Global Ties for Children. She is a developmental and educational psychology interested in measuring, examining, and supporting academic and socio-emotional learning of children in low-resource settings and crisis-affected contexts. Her current work includes research on effective ways to support children's learning and well-being in conflict-affected contexts across the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, and South and Southeast Asia. Last but not least, we have Rona Bronwyn, who is the education advisor for the FCDO and worked for FCDO education research team before moving to Ethiopia to work on the UK support to the government of Ethiopia's education reforms. Previously, Rona was a primary school teacher in London for many years and has worked closely with schools and teachers in the UK, Ethiopia, Ghana, Uganda, Kenya, and India. Rona works with the FCDO Girls Education Department based in London and leads the UK policy support to foundational learning globally. So fantastic range of panelists. So with that, I'm going to hand over to you, Jennifer. Go ahead, and I will be timing you, unfortunately. Over to you.
Great. Let me just share my screen. Did that work? So yeah. Great.
Yes.
Great. So hi, everyone. First, I just want to thank Edtech Hub for inviting me to speak about socio-emotional learning competencies and like what are the important skills. I'll be talking through 2 very brief examples that illustrate our approaches to defining like locally relevant social-emotional skills in a crisis context. So at International Rescue Committee, just to remind everyone, we solely work in conflict and crisis, and that includes health crisis like COVID-19. So a lot of the social-emotional learning skills that we focus on and prioritize are those that are relevant to mitigating a lot of the negative effects of toxic stress and addressing a lot of the types of adversities that children experience in conflict or crisis, like displacement, losing relatives that are close to them, sort of witnessing violence, and also even just extreme poverty. And the experience of, I think, education in emergency, the community, it's very related to the COVID-19 pandemic experience, where we've had, years and decades of experience with disrupted education, and also, balancing both academic and the well-being outcomes of children. So just quickly a little on our IRC's approach to education. Learning in a healing classroom has been foundational to IRC's education programs for more than 15 years. In all programs, we support and train teachers to establish safe, nurturing, and predictable learning environments. We create and provide culturally relevant teaching and learning materials to build both academic and social emotional skills. And we connect parents, caregivers with schools. Just in terms of a little about why social emotional learning and the skills, like Healing Classrooms really started decades ago because we had heard from teachers. What we had heard from teachers is that students need something more than reading and math in conflict and crisis contexts. Teachers were seeing behaviors and levels of emotional distress that they were not really trained to address. So IRC engaged in 4 years of action research in which students and teachers defined well-being and daily classroom routines and practices that improve it. It's really not surprising that teachers turned out to be right. We now know from research and neuroscience that children in crisis who have prolonged exposure to severe adversities, including displacement, disrupted education, violence, extreme poverty, but also things that we see in COVID, like loss of close relatives and death, that this can lead to a toxic stress response, which disrupts healthy brain development and has short and long-term impacts on children's mental health, ability to learn, behaviors, and relationships. So for us, social emotional learning is particularly important to mitigate the effects of toxic stress. Looking at sort of with neuroscience and MRI at the cognition and social processes that are disrupted, we focus on skills like being able to focus and manage information, short-term memory, being able to self-regulate, control emotions and behaviors, really getting along with others, so that fight and flight response, being able to get along with others, but also being able to persevere and solve problems when you face setbacks. There's just as the evidence has grown in stable settings on social emotional learning, IRC had found, and alongside its main academic partner is NYU Ties, and High-End on this panel is part of that there wasn't really research being conducted in conflict and crisis on social emotional learning. So IRC took on an effort to conduct a series of randomized controlled trials in different contexts, again, closely with NYU Ties, but also other academic partners. And just in summary, we can definitely talk, for hours about this. We found that we had some results, but that some of those results were mixed. We didn't have the kind of impact that we had really hoped for, expected on all of the social emotional outcomes that we were seeking. And some of our hypothesis was related to issues around dosage, attendance, teacher training, but also we received a lot of feedback via qualitative research, particularly in Nigeria, from teachers, education officials, and even our own staff, that teachers really struggled with some of the basic social emotional learning concepts, and they had difficulty implementing social emotional learning. So IRC's response to that research was really by focusing on how to really better contextualize social emotional learning, really have locally led identification of skills and development of teaching and learning materials. So I'll just briefly describe like two of these examples. So in Nigeria, with funding from USAID, we did this by really researching the values, beliefs, priorities of teachers and students while we designed the project. So we used behavioral insights, so our team of behavioral scientists, and human-centered design to really engage teachers in co-creation of social emotional learning activities that teachers themselves could iteratively test in the classroom and in real time kind of adapt and change. Just an example of what came out of that. was that teachers had identified discipline, obedience, respect, and tolerance as key social-emotional learning skills. We were also able to source a lot of games, songs, and stories that teachers already used to promote specific values. So we also mapped it against sort of global evidence-based frameworks. So you can see like obedience and discipline did match to things like focus, paying attention, following directions, self-regulating, controlling impulses and behavior, empathy, perspective taking. It did match with we were able to match against and kind of come up with a common language.
Jennifer, you have 3 minutes left.
Okay, so this is just an example of what can come out of the use of when you use global evidence-based frameworks and local identification of skills, how you can end up with social-emotional skills that are evidence-based, but also locally relevant. Just the other example that I want to show is a play-based social-emotional audio program that's funded by LEGO for children 3 to 12 in Colombia, in which we partnered with a local media company called Clique Arte. And so Clique Arte already had locally relevant and like beloved characters, stories, and songs that spoke to local values and beliefs. And so in addition to that, we also established an advisory board with content experts that were global and regional on social emotional learning, mental health, education, who really helped us identify the social emotional skills and child profiles upon which this local media company could build to develop its culturally relevant audio program. And so this is just an example of what came out of that. We did a survey with this advisory group, and we had content workshops, and we consulted staff. So a lot of them, what came out of that was a priority of cognition skills. So a lot of the social emotional learning activities, the ask was that they be integrated also into literacy and numeracy, and that it not be standalone, but also concerns around children's ability to focus and pay attention. There was also a lot of tensions in Colombia between refugees and local populations. So they really identified conflict resolution, social cohesion, pro-social skills in conflict because of the chaos and the sort of just both from violence and displacement, but also because schools closed due to COVID, this issue of self-efficacy and locus of control, children feeling like, doesn't matter what I do, everything's out of my control. So self-efficacy became a critical skill. So that's just an example. And then it was identifying these skills, and then the local media company really took these into local songs, games, and stories to create really compelling radio sessions. And this is just that program. It continues, it's in Colombia, but also in Tanzania and Uganda. And so we do have episodes in Spanish and in multiple languages. And it is an audio-based program that's reached mainly through radio, but also through SMS, WhatsApp, and IVR. And so, yeah, I think did I fit within my 10 minutes?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was great. And it's a really interesting way to start the discussions, looking at these two particular programs and also setting the scene a little bit. So we're going to take all questions at the end, and please, the audience, do continue to post in the questions, and then we'll take them in one group at the end. So now I'm going to hand over to Shri Oberoi to present. Shri, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Fantastic. Go ahead. Over to you. You have 10 minutes.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Once again, thank you, for giving us this opportunity to share the work we have been doing at Akanksha and some of the learnings that we have had from our students and what they have seen in the last 2 years through this pandemic. And now that we see them coming back to schools, there is a lot that they're teaching us from their experience. So I would like us to all go through just a few minutes about the organization and the work we do here. May I share the screen? Yeah. So like we shared in the introduction that my organization, the Akanksha Foundation based in India, primarily works in Maharashtra. We started as a very small, after school center with few students run by college students. And now we are one of the largest networks, public-private partnership networks in Maharashtra here and in India. And we have 27 schools. We recently expanded to Nagpur as well. And the primary work has been in Pune and Mumbai areas. Where we started with few college students as educators. Now we have 600 plus educators who are very dedicated and working with our students. It's we work primarily in the low income communities, and our parents come from backgrounds like daily wage earners, doing small jobs, mothers being maids and household help, parents being drivers, vegetable vendors, and so on. So we understood right from the beginning that parents are going to be our equal partners in taking our students towards academic achievement. Well-being has to be at the core of everything that we do for our parents, students, as well as our educators. So that's been one of our focus while we're looking at academic achievement through holistic development of all our students. We hope that the work that we do will transform our students' life and will help them maximize their potential. And we've been able to see that impact in our 4,000 plus alumni who are in multiple colleges and universities, and we see that impact already, and we continue to, we hope to see that in the coming years as well. While we have 27 schools, and these are more like model schools, we wish to take our learnings to other schools and have a larger impact and share our learning to all the other networks and schools, and of course learn from them as well. So it's an ongoing partnership between Akanksha and other schools as well. When 2 years ago, when we went into lockdown, and suddenly in the month of March, the schools had to be closed literally, just 2 days notice, or even less than that. Our biggest challenge in front of us was that our parents were in lockdown, so they lost their employment. There was scarcity of food and ration. Safety was at risk. These are very tight communities with very small living spaces, with large number of students, large number of members in the families. And it became, we had to really look at what our priorities and what do we need to do for our students. So the first thing was to look at care and safety, and what do our parents need. So providing ration kits, providing medical supplies, and ensuring that we are in connection, we are in touch with all our parents was the first thing that we needed to do. So we started something like a well-being call. So every student would receive a call at home through a teacher, and ensure that we are checking on all the different domains of well-being so that we know what the needs are. We made sure that we give ration kits to the communities, because that would be the essential first part, and the medical supplies as well. Immediately, as we started doing these calls, we realized there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of physical safety related aspects. There is increase in domestic violence, and we needed to immediately come in to provide mental health care and counseling as well. Later on, in a few months, there was empowerment, employment opportunities, and a lot of work with the parents, along with sensitization for the vaccination. So from the holistic learning and what we do with the students, from parent engagement, moving to now what is the current need of our students and families, it shifted for us in the 2 years, and this wasn't possible to do it all by ourselves. We had all our parent communities. Every community, even if they were struggling, they came forward to help, whether it is to provide the ration kits and be out in the lockdown areas, even to take these door to door. Many of them, even if they had limitations of their own resources, they came forward to do something more for the community in whichever they could. Our alumni came forward to be on the ground and support all the communities. So there was a lot of compassion, a lot of going out of their way, a lot of resilience that we saw in action in our students as well as in our parents. In terms of learning, we see there is going to be a lot of classroom learning and moving to virtual learning in some form of blended learning. But coming to, in this, give me 1 second, please. I just want to stop share and yes. So in terms of what we have seen and what we've learned from our students is that our students and parents showed a lot of resilience. There's a lot of compassion and kindness for each other. There was a lot of, going out of their way. And while socio-emotional learning has never been new for Akanksha, we have always had that at the core of our learning. And for our students, we realized that during this time, we needed to do something that is a lot more structured. We needed to make sure that we reach every student, every parent, and every teacher through a structured program. Just a few months before the pandemic, we were in conversations and we had also gone through a training of the socio-emotional and ethical curriculum developed by the Emory University under the guidance of the Holo Dalai Lama. And we were planning to implement that from the coming academic year. The entire curriculum is set or meant for physical in-person classroom experience. We took the decision of taking some of the most important or the relevant practices from the curriculum and changing, making it context-based, translating some of these and making it into smaller bite-sized pieces for the students. To be able to do that effectively, and not just for that, but even the teachers are going through a lot of stress. So we needed to have something for the teachers, and we formed a separate group that works only with the teachers. Now, teachers and students can create that.
Shri, 3 minutes left.
Yeah, so when teachers and students are doing this, the parents also needed to be part of this. So we had for the parents as well. So making sure that all the stakeholders are part of this learning and ensuring that well-being in terms of learning all of these self-regulation practices was part of our core work that we did for last years. What we've seen is, and seeing the evidences of some of that work now, is that students are picking up self-management, self-regulation really well. They also have vocabulary for self-awareness and so on. However, we need to build more of that. We need to build more into an ongoing practice that comes naturally. We also need to work a lot more on just the relationship building and the collaboration, and then moving from there, communication as well. So some of the 4 C's that become primary focus areas and the continuing the SEL skills of self-regulation management and self-awareness with compassion, that is an ongoing work that we need to see. On the whole, just supporting the child from self to others is an important part, and in others, integrating the entire community is going to be the primary focus. So yeah, that's kind of what we have taken from our experience. There is a lot of work to be done. Of course, the pandemic has taught us, where we need to focus and what we need to do more. And our students are coming back and telling us more that will be built into the programs and the efforts.
Thank you so much, Jayashree. Really what stands out to me is the kind of the extent of your network and the kind of the ability to mobilize this and adjust and adapt in this COVID context, and working with parents and teachers. So really, and the role of the private sector and all of that as well. So I found that fascinating. Thank you so much, and for keeping to time as well. So now I'm going to pass over to Ha-Yeon. And again, Ha-Yeon, is that, are you there? Yes.
Yes.
You're there. And please, over to you. You have 10 minutes again. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to take part in this discussion. My presentation will more focusing on the more theoretical speculation about what the post-pandemic world would look like, and what are the kids bringing in, what kind of skills they are bringing in, and how that would interact with the post-pandemic world that we are thinking about when it comes to EdTech. So as we all know, the COVID has caused the unprecedented interruption in schooling across the globe. According to this UNESCO statistics, out of 210 countries that are surveyed, 104 countries fully or partially closed the schools for the more than a full school year, 36 weeks. So, and globally on average, that number was 38 weeks as of March 2022. So as a response to such global scale interruption in learning and schooling, the EdTech solution became somewhat a universal savior for the education around the world, with 99% of the countries providing at least one remote learning modality for their school-age population. When we actually think about EdTech, this is one of the stock photos that came up, a child working with an interactive remote learning contents on her own tablet with stylus, learning about laws of physics. She's apparently learning E equals MC square. But that's not always the case. Going through a pandemic, we know that's not what it always looked like, and not all EdTech is equal. It could be, it could look more like this: a child working on their worksheet, listening to a radio, or watching a televised lesson. So 96% of the high-income countries provided the remote learning through online platforms for at least one education level, compared to only 58% of the low-income countries. The broadcasting media, such as radio, were the more common solution among the low-income countries during pandemic. And it actually, it can look actually more like this in many parts of the world. And as you can see, in a more disadvantaged and crisis, especially the crisis-affected context, it would be more like multiple children sharing a device among with the limited learning space and resources. And as you can imagine, engaging in actually learning in the remote education platform or process through these very different types of settings of EdTech would come with a very different demands of students and children's socio-emotional skills. And such variable educational experiences in the past couple of years, now the children are coming back to a challenging educational landscape in the post-pandemic world. There are a lot of challenges that we can expect. For example, the schools and educators will have to, and already dealing with, and educating children coming in with great range of different learning levels and learning losses they experienced during pandemic, with great variation in terms of the exposure and kind of experience they had with their remote learning platforms and modalities. And the children are coming back to a system with inconsistent and inequitable learning opportunities and policies, with the often fractured educational policy and programming around remote learning and EdTech solutions that are quite ill-equipped to accommodate the variability that exists in the post-pandemic world of education. In addition, more often than not, and partially because as a solution to address these variabilities, there are likely to be increasing demands to incorporate remote and digital-based learning to the regular schooling experience, either that to be a form of hybrid learning or digital remedial education or homework and so on. So like it or not, the world is becoming more digital and remote learning focused, it seems like, and it will be here to stay. So now I'd like to turn to a topic of the day, which is what the digitally enhanced world requires of the young learners, and what would be the demands in the post-pandemic world. And I want to start with more advanced and accessible platform of learning, which would be a more interactive digital platform of learning. And even in this learning mode, the remote learning process can involve additional demands on students' behavior, cognition, social skills, and emotional development. Firstly, the remote learning environment is often lack physical structure that can help maintain routines and reduce distraction. As you can see in this photo, and I'm sure everyone have experienced that, and cognitively, children are required to manage, pay attention to, and learn on many different platforms and modality, like this girl in the second photo, who is attending a class on her computer while engaging in a learning activity on her phone. It's a lot of cognitive stimulus and demands and skill to manage. And socially, children are not only physically isolated, but also need to learn how to interact and communicate on different platforms. The way you express yourself may look different, and it might be harder to understand other people's perspective and read others certain social cues when there is a physical separation. And emotionally, mental health and emotional challenges that the children are bringing in during the pandemic, combined with limited opportunities to learn and express their emotions through social interaction, may have lasting effects even after they come back to in-person learning.
3 minutes left.
Oh, wow. Okay. So in order to meet these demands, we can think of different specific skills, which would include self-regulation skills. We have some evidence that children who have a higher level of self-regulation perform better in their self-regulated learning in the remote learning context. From a study from Peru. And secondly, the executive function skills, the children's ability to attend and remember and cognitively flexibly deploy their attentions are necessary. And thirdly, the social skills that are way to learn to communicate on different platforms, and also learning to interact with the classmates and teachers in person as well will be necessary in the post-pandemic world. And lastly, on the emotional front, the children need to learn to identify, express, and regulate emotions with limited learning opportunities in social settings. So while we have these skills identified, this might be actually the skills that the pandemic have affected the most. So we can learn some lessons from the study with the refugee population and conflict population that went through interruption in schooling. In our study with the Syrian refugee children, we found that children who are placed in a lower grade than expected showed poor executive skills, executive function skills, and behavior self-regulation skills. And these findings are concerning, as it is suggesting that children coming back to the digitally enhanced post-pandemic world would be lacking the precise social-emotional skills that they need to succeed. Now, on top of that, the variation of the children's experience during and the post-pandemic can also exacerbate the inequitable opportunity to learn necessary SEL skills. So first, considering their experience of the conflict and violence that's increasing right now very much in the world, that affects social-emotional skills that are necessary for the digital readiness support learning, such as executive function skills, social functioning, and emotional and behavior challenges that they have reported. And also we see that the children who experience more diverse events that are related to COVID pandemic, including health, economic issues, or the family challenges during the COVID, they were more likely to be affected in terms of their emotional ability to express themselves and understand emotions. And lastly, and probably predictively, the experience with the EdTech and remote learning matters. So in the same study in Peru, the more children engaged in the remote learning activities, we found the better self-regulated the child is. So we have a few suggestions how to reduce the inequitable demands on SEL in the digitally enhanced world. The first is addressing the educational systems and policies so that they can consider and account for different access and experience of the remote learning and EdTech among their population. And secondly, unequal access to remote learning continues to dip in the global learning crisis and the gap. So investing in equitable access to high quality EdTech infrastructure can increase the address some of the inequitable demands.
I'm going to have to stop you, Jan. I've been told that we're very over time. So maybe just summarize in like just a minute.
Okay, thank you. So lastly, I also, we can think about designing EdTech to reduce the demands on SEL as well. And in terms of actually supporting SEL itself, there are three areas that I would like to highlight, which is measuring and monitoring SEL through EdTech, and explicitly providing SEL support through EdTech that could have a wider reach to reduce the inequity. And lastly, focusing on supporting the teachers and caregivers who will be supporting children's SEL skills. Thank you so much, and I apologize for that time.
Thank you, Hayuan. I'm sorry to make you go faster. It's all really fascinating stuff and really interesting to think about kind of the inequalities, the inequities, and how COVID is exacerbating these and how we might also address them kind of going forward also through EdTech. So that's all fantastic stuff. Thank you so much, and apologies for chasing you. Over to you, Rona. I think we have Rona there. Yes, go ahead, Rona.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much. Great, yeah, thanks for inviting me. My name is Rona Bronwyn from the UK's Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, FCDO. So I'm going to be speaking from a bigger picture policy lens today. And in my 10 minutes, I'm going to touch on FCDO's approach to foundational learning, lessons from COVID-19 and some successful examples of building socio-emotional learning. But as I go, I'm going to signpost 5 key challenges and therefore potential opportunities for tech to build SEL. So as foundational learning policy lead, I will start here. So to be clear, when we're, as the UK, talking about foundational learning, we are referring to basic literacy, basic numeracy, and transferable skills, which include socio-emotional learning. And now improving foundational learning for all is a priority. It was pre-pandemic due to the learning crisis, but now it's even more urgent due to the impact of COVID-19, the dramatic learning losses, and the essential role of foundational learning to support students to recover learning and progress. So to achieve this, we are interested in how to prioritise and measure foundational learning effectively, as well as drive country-led evidence-based reform to improve learning at scale for all. So the SDG 4 milestone targets, which were agreed and endorsed by the G7 last year, help to focus on foundational learning using the best proxy measurement we have on reading. But of course, children's learning is interconnected and interdependent. So foundational learning includes socio-emotional learning, but there are also strong links between the different areas, so between socio-emotional learning and better literacy and numeracy, as well as the other way around. So this leads me to my first opportunity, which is how can we use the momentum and the focus on foundational learning post-pandemic to ensure we are improving literacy and numeracy in a way that also builds socio-emotional learning and vice versa. I know from my time as a primary teacher in the UK that socio-emotional learning is a large and often unrecognized part of a teacher's job, but it's always there, especially in the most effective classrooms. So underpinning interactions and activities embedded in teaching, as well as through discrete lessons and whole school approaches. But it's probably even less recognized in low-income environments, but it's just as important. And currently there are relatively few ways to assess primary school teachers' practices regarding SEL, and therefore little support to teachers on how to bake this into their work. So this leads me on to my second opportunity. How can we effectively measure SEL in different contexts in a way that reflects what children can actually do and supports teachers with their classroom practice and interactions? Now I'm going to move on to the impact of COVID-19 itself. So during school closures, I was in Ethiopia, and RISE Ethiopia was able to do some really important research on the impact of COVID-19 on socio-emotional learning. And their research found that since COVID-19, social-emotional learning reduced, particularly amongst rural boys and girls. They also found a positive and significant relationship between children's social skills and numeracy, and an important link between social-emotional learning and mental health. So clearly, there have not only been significant learning losses in literacy and numeracy globally, but also large socio-emotional learning loss. And this has wider impacts on well-being and learning. And this is so important to better understand, not just due to the ongoing impact of COVID-19, but also in light of increasing shocks globally, whether that's due to conflict or the growing climate crisis. Already nearly 40 million children's learning is disrupted each year due to the climate crisis. So building resilient systems and resilient learners will be essential going forward. So this leads me to my third opportunity, which is the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that the youngest and the most marginalized were the most left behind and the least catered for in terms of remote learning during COVID-19. So how do we learn from this and make sure the youngest are not left behind during future shocks and that their social emotional needs are met? Of course, social emotional learning is not just important in early years and for the youngest children, but also for adolescents, and especially for the most marginalized as they navigate their progression through school and into work and with their families. During COVID-19, girls in low-income contexts, when asked, did want more support with life skills and social emotional learning. I think one study showed that they wanted to know how to strengthen their ability to continue their education, how to improve their communication and negotiation skills within the household, how to interact better with their peers, and how to improve relationships with other communities in the context of displacement. Young Lives have done lots on the relationships between poverty and social emotional learning as learners progress through adolescence and into adulthood. And they've explored what makes some young people more resilient than others in the face of shocks. So this is my fourth opportunity. How can we better respond to the need and demand from young people to ensure that they have the SEL competencies that they need that best speak to their lived experience and recognise the wider barriers and inequities they face? The SCDO's Girls Education Challenge portfolio has frequently identified the power of peer mentoring and girls' clubs to improve social emotional learning. For example, Camped's successful focus on social emotional skills to build girls' resilience in education. And during COVID, there were many examples from the get, including lots of innovative use of technology. For example, the SAGE project in Zimbabwe, supporting over 21,000 girls, kept in contact with them through SMS and mobile phone, used mobile phone to conduct surveys to shape its approach in terms of content and delivery, and in sending out bulk SMS messaging with focus on well-being and safeguarding. And in the Engine project in Nigeria, it used WhatsApp and Facebook to keep older girls connected to each other and their mentors and adapting to the needs on specific groups. I think more general findings on using tech to improve life skills and SEL for girls at a distance seem to reflect some of the overall findings on using tech to improve learning remotely. So Firstly, you need an integrated approach that includes a mix of media, including low and no tech. Any tool that allows space for interaction at its heart has a stronger impact. And using tech must build on the existing and available technology. So clearly the GEC and many other examples show that there is room for using tech to improve social emotional learning, but we also know that the digital divide, and within this, the digital gender divide, are essential to keep front and center. So this leads me to my fifth and final opportunity.
You have 3 minutes for that, Rona.
Well, I will finish nice and early. But yeah, this is how can we learn from the successful examples and build social emotional learning which helps children to overcome the inequities and disadvantage they face and does not exacerbate it. So the five opportunities that I've raised today are the prioritization of foundational learning, the innovation and implementation of social emotional learning data, and the learning from COVID-19 to ensure social emotional learning support for the youngest and the most marginalized, especially during future shocks. And finally, the necessity to keep equity at the heart of this discussion. I think that's mostly what I've got time for. So I'm happy to hand back to you, make sure we've got plenty of time for questions, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Rona, so much. I think you've raised lots of challenges and questions for us all to kind of start to think with it as we progress forward. I'm going to now open the floor for questions, and I have, maybe if everybody, all the speakers could come back and put their videos on so we can all see you, if that's okay, everybody. And what I've been receiving, maybe we can all be in gallery, and then I can. So I've been receiving. The audience have been posting lots of questions. The wonderful colleagues in the background have been summarizing some of these into my WhatsApp. So what I think I might do, there's so many questions here. I think I might ask each of you a couple of questions, and so I'll ask first Jennifer a couple, then Jaishu a couple, etc. And then we'll go for a next round and see how we are with timing. So first, a couple of first questions for you, Jennifer. So the questions are, and this is quite a general one, and maybe also Ha-Yuan might also want to respond to this. So what are the challenges of designing large-scale RCTs for SEL in crisis contexts? This is the one question for you, Jennifer. And another question is, does the focus on SEL for children with adverse experiences automatically ensure healthy identity development? Or can focusing on identity development bring together diverse SEL research programs? So I'm going to let you respond to those two first, and then I'm going to continue with the others. So over to you, Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm also going to let Ha-Yuan help answer the first question, but basically one of our big lessons learned with social emotional learning in particular is we did sort of start with randomized controlled trials, and we did find that the mixed results, we hadn't collected a lot of the data we needed to really understand why those social emotional learning programs had such mixed results. But the key learning was, definitely wanting to step back from RCTs and first engage in design research. So, some of the things I talked about really identifying what are the skills that are relevant, figuring out what is feasible, desirable in a classroom. So how long should a SEL activity be? Should it be integrated into a subject or standalone? What types of activities and what's the right dosage? So, really focusing first on design research, but then implementation research in terms of, is this something like we should be able to observe first? Is this something that teachers can really implement, really sustain, really want, before we then jump to a randomized controlled trial? So I think the RCT was good in that it disrupted a lot of the status quo in terms of starting with evidence-based social-emotional learning content and then doing light adaptation, not fully diving into, how much social-emotional learning is really needs to be contextualized and aligned with local values. It's very value-based. What do people think is important outside of academic skills for kids to do well, for them to cope with adversity? So I think that was like our biggest lesson learned. And then of course we had, Hyen could speak to, like, doing randomized controlled trials in crisis context is definitely feasible and we should do it. Absolutely. But it was challenging. So I don't know if Hyen, you want to speak a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally 100% agree with you, Jennifer, on the needs for the design studies and more pilots to ensure the program, we have the program that we can test the effectiveness on, and what could be the different components of those interventions that matters. So having said that, and also that process should also contain very extensive contextualization, what works in that context with that population and how it might look different when it gets scaled up for the capacity to do the RCT level sample size and so on. The challenges of doing the research, like Jennifer said, is definitely doable. I think one of the biggest challenge is the different understanding of what research needs in terms of the monitoring. The difference between program monitoring and research is a different animal in terms of the data collection. So there was a lot of capacity building that was necessary. There was a lot of challenges with the data collection, but also the population itself is very mobile, and there are just no good system to track the children over time, and RCT often requires a longitudinal design, and tracking down the kids who have, let's say, named Muhammad, we don't know their birthdays. It's very difficult to do in the ground. And I really appreciate the capacity of the humanitarian organizations and their ability to actually work with the kids very individualized fashion. And without that, it will be very challenging, but it's definitely doable.
Thank you. Jennifer, would you like to respond to the second question that I put to you?
Yeah, so part of social-emotional learning, like if you look at, I'm thinking we collaborated in Nigeria with the Harvard ESO lab, and some of the social-emotional learning areas around, I'd mentioned like cognition, emotion, but identity is one of the social-emotional learning areas. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, like the teachers hadn't prioritized that, and in Colombia similarly, but totally agree that identity around ethnicity and religion and your situation, and particularly thinking about like in Colombia, like refugees that are integrated into local schools and how that affects their identity, their sense of belonging, their inclusion, their idea of what their future will be like, definitely should be, a priority area when you're looking at social emotional learning. It shouldn't be ignored. It was just that wasn't prioritized by teachers themselves, but I think if we had asked caregivers or Ministry of Education officials, we might have gotten a different answer.
Okay, I'm going to move quickly on and so if people can, to try and get in as many questions as possible, if people can try and give succinct answers, that would be fantastic. I know we could all talk about this for hours. So Jayashri, a couple of questions for you, and please do succinct so we can keep going. So what specific shifts in the SEL skills have you seen post-pandemic, i.e. the skills that are needed and displayed? And how has the sudden digitization post-pandemic impacted this shift in skills? So that's one question, broad question. And then the other one is, how did Akanksha Foundation assess the efficacy of the multiple intervention components within the Project Karuna, especially that which is labor intensive, such as the SEL wellbeing calls and individual counseling that you were talking about? So over to you, Jayashri.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be as brief as possible. So I would say rather than shift in the SEL skills, what became very visible is resilience and compassion in our students, which was maybe it was hidden or we couldn't see it. Maybe because there weren't so many opportunities. What became very important is the self-regulation and self-awareness and practices and a vocabulary around that. It's not that it wasn't there, but it needed to have specific vocabulary. It needed to have a set of help now strategies that the students can practice. Also needed to have the direct connection of body awareness to emotional awareness to then understanding that I am going out of the okay zone or resilient zone and I need to something to do about it. So that entire cognitive process of observing, analyzing, and then decision making around this was the shift that we saw being built through the efforts, and also there was a need for this. So I think that has been one of the major shifts that we've seen. And like I said in the presentation, that we see along with this, there are more areas that we need to work, and we need to continue working in this as well. So that's kind of for the future. And compassion stays at the core of it, and the other areas that go along with it are equally important. So that's the brief answer to the first question. And the second one is about assessing the efficacy of the labor intensive. So one was it was important first capacity building and the training for the teachers. So doing something new effectively is important. So that was one. Second one is ongoing data management and tracking of this. So while we have easy system, it needs to be tracked, and we need to ensure not for the purpose of whether it is happening or not, but it is with the purpose of is every student being connected or not. So it's a student-centric approach, and that automatically created space within the school, within the timetable of a teacher to be able to do that. So we need to also provide that system. So we have the training, we have the system, and also have the time to be able to do that and monitor that ongoing on an ongoing basis from the lens of the need for it, need for the connection, rather than need for kind of ticking the box of doing the program or not. And then the last one is checking or looking at the impact of this and connecting the teachers with that impact. So we've had hundreds of cases come up as critical cases, thousands of cases for the food supplies and for medical help, but then critical cases of domestic violence and other physical violence cases coming up. Circling back that to the teachers, which then makes them feel worth what they're doing and putting in that time. So the labor-intensive work feels a lot more fruitful and meaningful when it is connected to the impact of the students. So I would say that is how we try to keep that going for the last 2 years, and it is going on even now as well.
Thank you so much, Jayashree. I'm moving rapidly on because all these fascinating questions and my team behind me are chasing me with time, and I'm going to take a few more minutes, I'm afraid, because we have to cover some more. So, Ha-Yeon, a couple of questions to you. So what are some of the challenges you foresee when it comes to implementing EdTech solutions in contexts where violent extremism could exploit children's increased presence online? And is there ultimately a limit to what EdTech can teach in terms of building SEL and delivering psychosocial support to children? So that's the one broad question. And the other question relates to homeschooling. So does the literature on homeschooling offer any insights for post-pandemic education policy design, especially that of restricted social interactions? So over to you, and then as succinct as possible. You're on mute.
Yeah, I'll try to be succinct, not my talent, but the challenge that I see with the EdTech when it comes to violent extremism, when it comes to education, it's the same challenge that they already experience in physical schooling as well. So the refugee population who are targeted for Western education are going through the similar challenges. I would imagine EdTech could be a better solution as it does not require physical attendance to the schooling, but that is a really good question, and we should be very sensitive and thoughtful about how to approach what we teach and what we program for those children who are at a more greater vulnerability. And I'm assuming Jennifer may have a better ideas, but And for the second point on the homeschooling, I am not aware of a lot of studies on social emotional learning components in the homeschooling. There are definitely arguments about homeschooling limiting the social restriction, and that could potentially impact on their outcomes. But I haven't really seen social emotional learning for those literature. So I would love to dig into it, and hopefully I can answer it later.
Thank you, Yon. Let's move on to a couple of questions for Rona. So first question, SEL is mostly seen as an add-on or an afterthought. How do we change that? And then the second question, as we heard from Jayashri, the whole community involvement is needed for skill development. How would funders see the investment in skills as different from basic literacy and numeracy? Oh, yes, over to you, Rona.
Thank you. So yes, I guess that first question mirrors my first opportunity and challenge, which was, it's not an add-on. You know, as a teacher, it's everything. It's the relationships that you build. It's how you build your children's, self-esteem and confidence and interactions with the classroom. It's within the subjects that you teach, across the different subject areas, as well as being maybe something discrete, but it cuts across absolutely everything. So I guess my opportunity was in the situation where we're really trying to build this momentum around foundational learning. So curriculum needs to be reformed, books need to be developed. There's so many opportunities and things that need to happen, even if you're looking at foundational learning within the narrow lens of literacy and numeracy. So how can you embed the socio-emotional learning skills within all these different pieces and components, whether that's teacher training, whether that's curriculum, books, all the different parts that you need within the system to be working. So completely agree. It needs to be cutting across everything that we do.
How can we push people to think like that? And in a way, we're all talking to the converted now, but how could we push people to think like yes, they can't be an add-on? I think that's what the question is getting at.
Yeah, so I guess one thing is making sure that the understanding of foundational learning is this holistic understanding, and when it's being used, that's how it's understood, and making sure that when things are being developed, that this is very much at the heart of it. I mean, one thing that we don't really know very much about, for example, is in terms of gender and the impact of improving foundational learning, and maybe the role of social emotional learning and the impact that has on gender transformation. There's also a lot of evidence that we don't have that we do need. So it's both the kind of practical action as well as the evidence that we need in this area to really understand how to do that. On the second question, can you just remind me what it was? Sorry.
It's about, I think the point was, how do we involve whole communities in this process? And I think Jayashri's work showed how it's critical. It's not just teachers, not just kids, but it's also parents and caregivers. And I think it's like how we involve them in that. But I've been told that we really need to wrap up this session. So maybe I unless you want to say something in 1 minute, Rona.
I'll just say one thing, which is, I mean, the one thing that COVID-19 has done is really broken down that barrier between school and home, and school and communities, and where that interaction is strong is where there's been the biggest resilience, and where it's weak has been the biggest challenges. So if we look at the COVID-19 GAP report recommendations, strengthening parental engagement is one of the key things that we need to do as part of learning recovery. So I think it's just to say that parental community engagement is essential in this piece. Thank you.
I completely agree with all of that. And I'm really happy, Rona, you mentioned the issue of gender, because I was kind of missing that a little bit from the other presentations. And in fact, it's something that we're working on quite a lot. So fantastic to hear all of that. Thank you so much for your presentations and response to the questions. I very much hope that there will be opportunity for you to respond to the other series of questions that have come up then. Thanks everybody, the audience, for putting your fantastic questions. And I'm going to hand back to Akanksha. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you everyone for such a wonderful discussion. I think we could have definitely gone on for much longer with this, and we will be following up with you to continue this discussion further. Without much ado, we will have to jump right into the next session, which is also really, really interesting. It's going to be a presentation by 100, which is an organization that does not need much of an introduction. For many years now, 100, which is a global education nonprofit based out of Finland, have been seeking and sharing impactful and scalable innovations in K-12 education. The Edtech Hub collaborated with 100 to highlight innovations at the intersection of socio-emotional learning and EdTech. And today we have Saku Tominen and Dr. Crystal Green presenting this work on behalf of 100, and we're very excited about it. Saku is the founder and creative director of 100. He has been working on the cusp of media, innovation, and creativity with a keen insight in creating change in the way humans work. He has authored 14 books about innovation, the future of office work, everyday creativity and decision-making, amongst other themes. And we also have Dr. Crystal Green. Crystal is the head of research at 100, where she's been working to develop the organization's research processes. She works on conducting multi-stakeholder research focused on finding practical solutions to ensure continued improvement of education around the world. Her passion as a researcher cuts across education, innovation, and well-being. Dr. Green holds expertise in teacher education in comparative contexts with a focus on equity and teacher agency. We take this opportunity to also launch this report that we have worked with 100 on. And over to you, Saku and Crystal.
Thank you so much. We are so excited to be here, and that was a great introduction. So I'm going to pass it over right now to Saku, who's going to say a little bit more about 100 and our organization.
Thank you, Akanksha. Thank you, Crystal. Also on my behalf, it's such a great pleasure to be here. I'm not going to be taking much of your time because I wanna give the digital floor to Crystal explaining what we are concretely doing. But maybe, Crystal, if you can change the slide, I want to say couple of simple things about 100. I've been following the and I think that as many of us have been following the education debate globally for some time, and if we are sort of like looking for the traditional way to approach any change happening anywhere, we can be approaching it through three lenses. One would be is that why is there a need for change? The second one would be is that what could the change look like? And then the third area could be is that, okay, how do you really make the change happen? And of course, when we are thinking about why to make the change happen, I think that it's quite obvious because the world is changing, education needs to change as well. And then what the change could look like. And I think that most of us actually agree on many key things. We need to be teaching things as creativity, cooperation, curiosity, and so forth, and also social-emotional learning and so on. And whenever we are, for example, I'm participating in education events, most of the discussion is concentrating on why and what. And then in 100, we are concentrating on how, meaning is that how do you really make the change happen at scale, being mindful of each and every child so that no one is left behind. So in brief, what we are doing is that we help improve education through impactful and scalable education innovations. And Crystal, if you can change the slide, I'll explain briefly what is our approach. Like mentioned is that it all starts with identifying education innovations. We try to identify what is out there, what works, and what has potential to work in more than one place. And we are selecting 100 innovations annually. concentrating on K-12 education. In addition to this one, we are also making spotlights which are built around a specific theme. We did one, for example, on creativity, another one with parental engagement, and we did one with Lego Foundation on social-emotional learning. And we will be telling some examples about that one in a minute. Once we have identified these innovations, we are trying to give them the visibility they deserve. Meaning is that we are trying to promote them in various possible ways. This kind of webinar being one example, education events being another one, connecting them with media, connecting them with funders is another one, and so forth. We are also trying to create valuable connections, for example, with education stakeholders, foundations, education experts, even VCs. Some of our innovations are non-profit, some of them are for-profit, but they are all trying to take the education into the direction we value. And then the last area, which we find extremely interesting, valuable, but also complex, is the side of implementation. How do you implement these innovations in various contexts, being mindful of the differences each and every country, each and every city, each and every classroom has? And that's really complex. And at the moment, for example, we are having 3 different projects. One, for example, with the city of Helsinki, where we are trying to identify both local and global well-being innovations. We try to select the best possible ones. We are piloting some of them, and then we start a long process on understanding is that what kind of innovations could work in every school of Helsinki. And of course, it takes months and years in order to get it right. Another example, for example, is a project we are doing with the state of Pennsylvania, where we are trying to improve parental engagement in the whole state. And all the work we are doing is based around our community. We are having country leads, we are having 100 ambassadors, we are having 100 youth ambassadors in over 100 countries. And whatever we do, we are having a close dialogue with people in all of these countries. And then maybe the last thing we want to say is that everything we do is always based on the crucial player, so to speak, in all of this, which is the child. So everything we do always starts with the child in mind. And then our mission is to help every child flourish in life, no matter what happens in life, also through the uncertain times. So whenever we are selecting any of these innovations, the key question we are asking is that, does this innovation help every child flourish? And if the answer is no, then we are not excited. So this is sort of like what we are trying to do in an extremely short period of time. Like Akansha was saying, is that we are a non-profit based in Helsinki, and we've been existing for 6 years. But now I think that it's more fruitful to really hear how does the work look like, and that's why I'll give it back to Crystal.
Thanks so much, Saku. Yeah, so I'm going to share a little bit about how it is that we have done this showcase. So as Saku was already saying before, we're talking about innovation in education. We're understanding innovation as meaningful improvements considered within the place of implementation to new or a modified practice or a technology that supports any part of the educational ecosystem. So we kind of have this kind of broad understanding of what innovation is as being something meaningful, but it's also related to the practice and also the place, and technology is a part of that as well. So we have 2 metrics that we're looking at when we choose these innovations. The first is impact, and the second is scalability. And you'll see these graphs as I go through this presentation. These are graphs where our advisory board members or our academy, who are our review boards who are reviewing these innovations, have mapped or kind of given a grade for impact and a grade for scalability. So these are some of the most impactful and most scalable innovations. The showcase that we did, we're so happy to have the opportunity to do this showcase. We have done a spotlight report with the Lego Foundation about social and emotional learning, but this is really about SEL at the intersection of EdTech. So we have selected 20 innovations that have been shortlisted or selected in all of our projects and spotlights to showcase here. And there is a report, and I think we have the link, and I can share that with you as well. You can download the report. So this has already been mentioned, but when we're thinking about like what kind of categories would we select into this showcase, there are these kind of three understandings of the intersection between technology and SEL. One is when technology is used as a tool to teach SEL. So like there's an app, you learn about emotional regulation on the app. The second one is technology is taught and SEL competencies are learned. So maybe you have like a robotics lesson, but that's teaching you collaboration. And then the third is that technology can be used for assessment of SEL competencies. I am only going to share, we have so little time, I'm only going to share a few of the 20 that were selected for this innovation showcase, but I'll go very quickly through some of them here. The first one is Dost Education in India. It's an EdTech nonprofit that focuses on early learning and responsive caregiving. This is the reviews, and the way that they do their innovation is that they have these 1-minute audio messages, which are delivered via phone call. So they call them phone casts, and they go out to parents 4 times a week. And I was really excited about the very last thing that Rona said, which is parental engagement is so important. And this is an innovation that we see really focusing on caregivers and how it is that EdTech can be leveraged to help caregivers also understand how it is that they can support their children's social and emotional development. The next is La Aldea. This is in Venezuela, and it's a multi-platform curriculum based on fables to educate children in citizenship and socio-emotional skills. So they have books, radio programs, songs, and digital content. And in 2020, they were able to pivot very quickly to try to get this content into the home so that they could, again, support parents, but then also support caregivers and teachers. As teachers, we're also trying to think about, okay, what kind of content can we bring very quickly into the classroom? And La Aldea was one of the innovations that was able to really do that like very well and pivot very quickly because of the range of content that they had available. This now I'd like to highlight is Mentes Habiles in Mexico. They have a digital pre-built courses that help teachers to develop their social and emotional skills. And this is something that I think is so important that came out really in our spotlight, but also in this is that the teacher's own competencies, the teacher's own social emotional competencies are really at the heart, because adults are very much at the heart of the kind of environment that is created for the students. So the teacher's ability to kind of understand their own social and emotional learning can have a big impact on how it is that the students go through that process also. So these help the teachers to develop social and emotional skills in adolescence. They have slides that the teachers can use to give during video conferences. And then in Kenya, I heard that like Kenya is also one of your focus areas. So Keep Kenya Learning was a collaborative effort. And it was, again, really to support parents and caregivers while they were transitioning to learning at home. So it's an SMS-based curriculum. And they do also like a video with, they have like multiple stages to the innovation, like there are multiple ways they're trying to get the caregivers to access this SMS-based curriculum. They also do videos with peer-parent role models, and they also do a digital literacy training with parents, but then they are also like building these communities together so that the parents can kind of together develop this digital literacy. And the last one is the Holo tracker in Singapore. And when we were going through, I know at the beginning I said like there are 3 different ways that SEL and EdTech can intersect. But when we did the showcase, what we really saw was that a lot, in fact, almost all of the innovations fit in that first bucket where they're like using EdTech as a tool to then deliver some kind of support, versus the second one where you're thinking like, okay, we're learning robotics or something like that. And then through the collaborative dynamics of learning robotics, then we're like learning about collaboration, or we're learning how to regulate our emotions or something like that. So, but then the third one, we do have this one example here, which is why we wanted to really highlight this, of where it is that that EdTech is used as an assessment tool for SEL. So this is a tool to collect large numbers of micro observations of the students. You can be used on a phone, tablet, or computer, and it provides the teacher with the real-time analytics and also formative reports on the student's holistic development. So I've listed here some additional resources, our spotlight on social and emotional learning, our spotlight on holistic education, as well in our global collection. Yes, that is all. I'll try to keep it short and then welcome the discussion.
Thank you so much, Crystal and Saku. That was a really fantastic and spot on presentation. I'm going to start off with one question before we start taking in questions from the audience as well. And that is in relation to something that was highlighted in the report as well, which says that the student's environment is taken into consideration in the development of the kinds of skills and the interventions that you've highlighted in this sub-spotlight. And that's, I guess, something that ties in as a common thread across SEL and differentiates it from foundational learning, which is you need a much bigger support system or an environment to build SEL. It cannot be done in traditional methods. Also, in terms of measurement, it varies a lot, but talking about just implementation and interventions. So what has been your sort of overview as you've looked at SEL interventions at large, and particularly in the context of EdTech, and how that might be able to support this intensive method that is required to teach SEL?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm so excited for people to have the chance to kind of look at all the 20 innovations. We had such a short time here, but actually one of the ways that this is done, and I noticed someone else was also mentioning the Harvard, the ESOL labs, and they have developed an innovation that's highlighted in this showcase, which is the Kernels of Practice. And that is a way that, like you're saying, that it takes a lot of support that can be very resource intensive to like have the time to go through the programs and learn how to do SEL, how to do a whole school model where it's really like every teacher has the time and chance to reflect on their own social and emotional learning and learn how to use the tools. But Kernels of Practice, the focus then is that they would have kind of these little kernels, and the idea is like a seed, like they would have these little pieces where they could incrementally implement SEL practices into their daily teaching in a way that is more bite-sized, in a way that is more manageable as they're going on. So I think that for me in the overview, it was really interesting to see that on the one hand, in the SEL Spotlight, we had these whole school models where you really see like this huge infrastructure where they even have child psychologists on the staff who are like supporting the teachers, and there's like, and it's really amazing what they're doing with that. But then also you see like Dost education where they're just sending an SMS to a parent and just really trying to help them to meet them where they are. And I think that in my mind, that's something that technology can do in like this amazing way, because you can meet them where they are in their living room when they pull out their phone. You can do that in both a way where you can manage the content of like how deep and in-depth the content is and like, or how simplified it is, but then also it's something that can be accessed at any time, kind of when and wherever parents are or teachers are.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and that's in relation to impact and scalability that 100 centrally focuses on. So if I were a school principal and I had to select an innovation, how would I go about doing that?
Well, I think it would start sort of, and maybe Saku would be the better one to answer this, but I think it starts with the school's own needs, right? And an understanding of your own needs. And I'm going to pass it to you, Saku, because I know you have the really good way to answer this.
Well, first of all, is that we are the first ones to admit is that it's not going to be simple. It's a complex and time-consuming operation to scale something, and of course it requires a lot of co-development throughout the years. But maybe there's 3 ways to approach this one. The first one would be is that if you find something really exciting, we can connect you with the innovator, and you can, for example, do a pilot with the innovator. That's one option. Then another option would be is that based on the innovation that makes you excited, you can be discussing with the local innovator and says that actually we are really excited about this one. And then the local innovator can do cooperation with the original innovator. And maybe the third one is that you have a feeling is that I'm really excited about the approach, but we don't have, we kind of like don't have a feeling is that this might work perfectly. So that can be sort of like as a seed for creating something totally new. So there's a huge amount of different kind of options in here. And we only, the key thing for us is that we want to encourage each and every education stakeholder to be curious, to be open about the beautiful solutions the world is full of. Because one of the key things in our approach is that in an extremely global world, education is still extremely local. And many countries don't really know the beautiful things that are happening in classrooms outside. So for us, it's partly about implementing innovations, but it's partly also about inspiration and being excited about the great work many teachers and innovators are doing as we speak.
Thank you, Saku. I think, I guess I'll just leave a question here before we move to the next section, which is in terms of evidence. So you look at scale and impact. But in terms of comparing innovations across various contexts, criteria, etc., I think particularly EdTech selectors or policymakers are struggling a little bit, and we've had requests asking, how do I select amongst 100 innovations in terms of what's going to be best at a district level or at a country level. So I think that intersection of evidence with impact and scalability is going to be quite crucial. And we would have loved to carry on this conversation further. We probably will offline, but thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. We have put the link to this report in the chat as well, so please do access that. And thank you once again. We will be moving on to the next section now, which is the third and final session. We're getting a little bit more specific in this section, and we'll really get into the nitty-gritties of this interaction of technology and SEL. So taking off from what Crystal said in terms of looking at technology to the intersection of a means to teach SEL, an end in and of itself, and as a means to assess SEL, we are now structuring the following panel. One thing to note, I think, I'm not sure if this has been noticed yet, is in particularly the post-pandemic and crisis context, we have skills like resilience, compassion, empathy emerging. But I do find creativity lacking pretty significantly, which doesn't seem to be a center point of the current context. And with that, I will introduce our next panelists. We have Dr. Elizabeth Mcclure, who is a research specialist in creativity, play, and learning at the LEGO Foundation. Her research cuts across technology and play and their role in socio-emotional learning. Along with research on young children, Elizabeth has also studied families and digital media. Her findings on the use of technology by babies and toddlers has been used to inform policies by the US Department of Education. Our next panelist in this section is Dr. Vajanti Shankar, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Science of Student Learning, CSSL, which is an organization known for its pioneering work on the measurement of socio-emotional learning. She has established credibility in South Asia's leading assessment and research expert over the last 2 decades. Vajanti, also known as VS, is an expert member of the Southeast Asia Ministers of Education Organization's Secretariat, a regional learning assessment center for Southeast Asia. She advises 21 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa for national learning assessments through UNICEF regional offices. And last but not the least, we have Danika Dimovska, who is the Chief Knowledge Officer at Jacobs Foundation, where she's been working to further the organization's impact goals of providing children with effective skills, attitudes, and equitable opportunities to reach their full learning potential and become socially responsible. She has worked extensively in the impact and innovation space to improve health and education systems in low and middle income country contexts. We're going to start off with our first speaker for this session, which is Elizabeth.
Hi, and can you see my screen?
Absolutely.
Right, all right, and it's in presentation mode, I hope?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. My name is Elizabeth Mcclure, and as Akanksha said, I come from the LEGO Foundation. And I'll be talking a bit about technology and social emotional skills, as everyone else has said. So when we talk about the social emotional skills children need in the modern world, we often are thinking about the skills that we need them to have as they get older. So what skills they need, for example, in order to contribute well to their communities, to the economy, to their work and their family lives when they're adults. And these are really important because it's not only about their thriving, but it's also about the thriving of our current and our future societies. These might be things like understanding and managing emotions, developing and maintaining positive relationships, communicating effectively, and showing empathy to others. There are a lot more. These are just some examples. Now, one approach to this, as we just heard, is to teach these social and emotional skills, like the ones that I've mentioned. So this is that first category that Hundred just discussed a moment ago. So for example, you can teach children about how to recognize and respond to different emotions in themselves or others. You can teach them mindfulness techniques to help develop their self-regulation skills. And programs like these that teach those skills explicitly, they're really important. They play an important role in supporting children's growth, especially during and after crisis. There are a lot of them out there right now, as Hundred just said. And technology can be a really great way to expand the reach of those programs. For example, with educational videos, with mindfulness apps, some of you might actually use those yourselves, or through text but message-based programming, interactive radio, those sorts of things. But today I want to talk about a slightly different question, which is, what supports do children need in order to develop those skills? The kind of broader environment that that was just being discussed by Akanksha and the colleagues from Hundred. What kinds of environments allow children's social emotional skills to grow and thrive? And how can we use technology to support that? So during and after a crisis like the pandemic, what support would children need in order to be able to understand and manage their emotions, to maintain positive relationships, to communicate effectively, to feel and show empathy for others, all of those things? A really brief summary might be that they need to feel safe. They need to feel loved and accepted exactly as they are, no matter what they feel. They need to have opportunities to express themselves in meaningful ways and feel heard when they do. And they need to feel deeply connected to others. These are things that can't really be taught though, right? So at least not in an explicit way. Things like feeling safe, loved, heard, connected, they come from a more holistic experience where those around them create a space that's filled with those things. And it really is a holistic environment that creates that. So instead of breaking these things down into teachable components, think of this more as, I'm just for fun going to call it the blueberry approach. You've probably heard blueberries are really good for you. They contain antioxidants, right? And as many know, it's possible now to buy concentrated antioxidants in pill form, so that you can get lots and lots of them without having to eat bowls and bowls of blueberries. But it turns out after 20 years of research on this, that taking antioxidant pills doesn't actually support good health. And that's because the reason blueberries are so good for you is that the antioxidants are mixed in with all sorts of other plant-based nutrients that team up with things like antioxidants and vitamin C to make them actually do these really great things in your body. And if you isolate them from one another, they don't really do the work that they're supposed to. The same goes for a lot of these great social emotional skills that can be taught, like being able to identify and regulate your emotions. Think of that like antioxidants and vitamin C. They're really important, but they work best when they're combined with a holistic environment where children feel safe, loved, heard, and connected. They need sort of the whole blueberry. But then you might ask, how on earth can technology support those sorts of things? It's a little harder to imagine how text messaging programs or educational technology can help children feel safe, loved, heard, connected. And that's because these aren't things that can be delivered. They're relational. So if you try to deliver these through technology at scale, it's really easy to get a kind of grainy, pixelated version of it. And it can be very difficult to get the kind of authentic experience. So this is where I think creative learning communities can come in. Instead of using technology as a way to deliver feelings of safety, love, connection, being heard, technology can be used as a way of prompting relationship and community development. So in these pictures, you can see that technology of various types, from puppets to Lego bricks to laptops, they're being used by children who are connecting with one another in meaningful ways. So the technology doesn't actually deliver anything. Instead, it prompts relationships between people and offers new opportunities for children to create and to express themselves with others. And I'd like to give you an example of the Prodigy Creativity Club. So during the pandemic, Pratham in India developed a tech program called Prodigy to reach out-of-school children in remote parts of India. But instead of delivering content digitally, they decided to use technology to prompt children to engage with each other and with their communities in creative and meaningful ways. So they use this framework that's here on the slide. Basically, a facilitator will visit a village once a week or maybe a few times a month to support a children's creativity club in the local area. They bring with them a device like a tablet, which has a short video on it to prompt a creative exploration. Then after the children watch the short video together, they discuss how they might want to explore that idea and what they want to make. Then they go get to work to experiment and make whatever this artifact is. And then they share what they've made with a partner village that they've been matched with. So here's an example. These children, this is just a screen grab from a video. These children watched a video asking them questions about the kinds of music that they hear and that they love. And after talking for a while, the children decided they wanted to go around their village and survey the kinds of music that the people in their village loved to make. So they interviewed many people in the village. They asked them to make that music for them. They took notes on it. They made videos of each person singing or playing an instrument, and they asked them questions about the music and the background from it. And then they shared that video and their observations with the partner village. You can see this video, by the way, on YouTube if you like. The title is in the top left corner. But I want to point out a few things here. First, this is not a program that developed content and then adapted it for a context and then delivered it. Instead, the technology here offered a meaningful prompt, a question that would be meaningful to any child in the world. Then the children themselves were the creators of the content. They got to decide how they wanted to interpret the question, how they wanted to respond, the type of thing they wanted to create to express their response. They were able to create something of real value to the world by documenting the musical traditions of their village. They weren't just the recipients of knowledge, but they were contributors to it. So their funds of knowledge, their experience, their culture was given a voice, and then that voice was amplified. Second, the technology, it's not infusing someone else's knowledge or culture into the community. Instead, it helps to foster these deeper community connections and sustains the local cultures in all their richness by prompting explorations and interactions between people there. The project supports children to develop a sense of identity and belonging in their community too. And third, I want to point out that the connections being made in this program are likely to outlast the intervention, because the technology isn't the source of learning, but instead is a prompt for it. So by its very design, the technology is really meant to plant a seed for relationships, to spark curiosity, all of which can really grow beyond those weekly meetings of the Creativity Club. And over time, the program hopefully will ignite a kind of habit of curiosity and creativity so that the children start to ask their own creative prompts together. And in fact, in this program, the older children are asked to be facilitators for the creativity clubs of the younger children.
Elizabeth, you have 3 minutes more.
Okay. So that's just one example among many others I could give you. There are some here of the amazing ways people are using technology to support creative learning communities for children, for adults, for families, towns all over the world. The creative communities give participants the social support that they need to thrive during challenging times, and the practice that they need to develop those social-emotional skills that are necessary today and in the future. And on top of all of that, the children pick up tech skills that will be valuable to them and to the communities. But all of these communities here and elsewhere, they have a few things in common. They all focus on building relationships first, where children feel safe. So in this example here, the creative community pictured is in a Syrian refugee camp. They focus on relationships where children feel loved and accepted just as they are, where children feel heard, where they can express themselves and share their ideas, feeling confident that their voice matters, and where they feel connected to others in a community. And when all of those things are in place, they can practice in holistic ways the social emotional skills they need to develop to thrive in the world. They can do it naturally. They can also do it with the support of the kind of formal programming and content to support the development through other types of technologies too, like apps. But with that, I'll come back to the original question about how technology can be used to support social emotional development. And I believe technology can do that best when children can be creators instead of users, when connection means something more than internet infrastructure, and when it's used as part of an atmosphere, again, where children feel safe, loved, heard, and connected. So at the end of the day, it's really not the technology doing the work. These things really depend on the mindsets of the adults that surround the children. It's kind of up to us, as it always has been, to create those caring, respectful environments for children to create in, and then use the power of technology to embody and expand that environment in new ways. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Elizabeth. And I think that really highlighted the importance of a sense of agency while we utilize technology. So yeah, that's really, really interesting. And we will now move on to our next panelist, who's Vajanti Shankar. And we've just talked about technology as not only a means, but also an end. And we now come into technology and SEL through assessments. So over to you, VS.
Yeah, thanks, Akanksha. I hope you can hear me now and see my screen as well.
Yeah, if you could go into full screen mode for the presentation.
Yes. Yeah, is it okay? Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me for being part of this panel for the EdTech Hub. So I'm Vajanti, as Akanksha introduced me. I'm going to be sharing about the work that we do in the assessment space. So how can technology support the development of SEL competencies? Before we go into that, a very, very brief introduction about the type of work we do.
Sorry, could you just go, not yet in full screen mode?
It's not in full screen mode. Is it okay?
Yes, now it is.
Okay, right, thank you. So CSSL, Center for Science of Student Learning, we are based in India. So we work with in three major areas. We build assessment capacity. We work in researching about the science of how children learn, and we build assessment tools. And we work with a number of partners, both in India as well as with other countries outside India. So here I'm going to be sharing our experience of conducting research leading to assessments, and the type of assessments and the insights that we are getting from some of these. Broadly, to just give you a flavor of the type of assessments that we do, this is apart from the academic, science, maths, STEM type of assessments, but we also do a lot of work in the SEL space, and which are largely, driven by the various aspects of SEL. So the work that we do in Maldives, for example, is about assessments and remedials to address learning loss all across Maldives. Very recently, we are also conducting an impact evaluation for UNICEF's SEL UA interventions. There are about 16 EdTech partners all across India. Pratham being one of them, which was mentioned by Lego earlier, as well as various other partners all across India who are carrying out EdTech programs. And so we are helping to measure and see whether some of these programs are having an impact, because the funders would like to use this information to select programs which have better scalability and better reach and so on. The Life Skills Collaborative is another experiment that we are doing, where we are the national assessment partner for building future readiness skills assessment. And again, 4 states and 18 partners are involved in this. So multiple, the same tool available in multiple languages across representative sample study across the different states, which are meant for scaling across the states. Again, I'll share some findings from that. The other part of the work that the research we do are also like, how do you engage, like many of our assessments bring out why children are answering in specific ways when it comes to different aspects of SEL, but digging deeper into why they would answer so, what is the background, what is the story behind why children choose certain answers, etc. So that we conduct through student video, interview video studies, where we invite students across both physically in an offline format as well as in an online Zoom format, etc., where students across different schools, their parents, teachers, etc., come across and then talk about various aspects related to SEL and attitudes, etc. The cognitive and affective skill studies and other pioneering studies, we are coming out with a series of reports related to that, which I'll again talk about later. So this is across 3 states and 5 metro cities, all types of schools, both the lower income government schools as well as the upmarket, what we call as the elite private schools in some of our metro cities. Similarly, other projects are, looking at different types of children, for example, who are not mainstream, like the shelter children or tribal children in the soft skills study for Tata Trust, etc. So a number of different types of research studies and through assessments done in the SEL space is what is the background for some of the insights I'll be sharing in the next few slides. So the 4 broad areas of the assessments that we do in the SEL space, one is the future readiness skills assessment. So this assessment is what we have been doing for the UNICEF UA project or the Life Skills Collaborator. So this looks at about 13 skills, which are in the space of what we call as the thinking skills, like problem solving, critical thinking, decision making, information search, creativity, and so on. Relationship skills like communication, collaboration, conflict resolution. Then what we call as transformational entrepreneurship skills, like what we would call as taking initiative and handling risk, having what we call mastery orientation, and then having accountability and delayed gratification. So a range of 13 skills are being measured at both the junior adolescent level and the senior adolescent level in this particular project. The second type of assessments we build is a social-emotional learning assessment battery, which looks at aspects like emotional concept attainment. So the previous speaker before me spoke about how do you acquire emotions, how do you understand your own emotions and others' emotions, how do you, so we go deeper into the emotional concept attainment itself, because there's a very strong theoretical framework and basis on how this is acquired. So we try to measure that. And then emotional regulation like affect and behavior, and also relationship skills. Then the third part of the assessment we do is what we call a school climate index. Here teachers, principals, as well as students get assessed, not only on resources in school, but also relationships in school, learning climate like the pro-social learning and various aspects like that. And the last would be what we call as the learning place attitude audit. So here we look at values and beliefs leading to attitudes, and attitudes of parents, attitudes of teachers, attitudes of head teachers, as well as attitudes of students, and we triangulate that information. So when we look at attitude here, again, it's a very long tool where we look at attitude towards self itself, attitude towards what we call as the immediate others or significant others. For example, if for a student, it would be the peer, it would be the teacher, it would be the parent. Attitude towards school activities and school subjects, and then what are more importantly, attitude towards social objects like inclusivity, gender, diversity, and various other aspects related to the social sense like global citizenship and so on. So these are the types of assessment we do and projects we do. So now I'm going to be talking about the broader insights related to our work.
Yes, you have 3 minutes to go.
Oh, let me rush through that. So the challenges in SEL interventions is that fundamentally there is a wide variety of a plethora of taxonomy related to that, where different people will be talking about the same word but in different sense and so on. So that is a fundamental thing. And second, we would see that most of the models that we see in interventions that we measure across also, like generally they are not based on an empirically validated model, so that is another major issue that we find. And when it comes from the measurement perspective, we find that there is no well-established tools. Like, for example, most of the tools are like self-reports and, as opposed to what I would call as a vignette approach. So what I mean by a vignette approach would be something like this, where it's not a self-report. You actually give a story or a context, and then you ask the child to respond to it, where you are not asking the child directly, but indirectly, where the child is not there in the context. But through that, you are able to sort of judge or diagnose what or how the child will actually behave in life. So this is approach which has been used in health research very extensively, and this is what we do very differently when it comes to when we are building our tools. What are the findings on all this research that we do? I'm just sharing a few of them here. For example, when you look at emotional acquisition, you will find that there are differential rates. For example, child will acquire happiness much quicker than, for example, anger, which is much more quicker than, like, for example, surprise or disgust, etc. And these are also like very different at different ages. So they will be different for the cultural context. They will be also different for different ages. Relationship skills like communication, collaboration, and conflict are the weakest among all the SEL skills. What we also find is that students, if they do not acquire it in grade 3 or 4 level, they do not really improve upon it. If improvement is seen, it's very small and marginal in terms of magnitude. So when we say relationship skill is weak among the SEL skills, but if you look at critical thinking, problem solving, creativity type of thinking skills, they are even more weaker than relationship skills. And student attitudes to social objects will be largely influenced by the parental attitude. So if a parent has a specific attitude, students would tend to carry that same attitude. So therefore, it has a lot of meaning for intervention. You are trying to address the student attitude, but if the parental attitude doesn't change, you will not find much change in the student attitude. School safety is student safety is a big issue in India schools. Whether it's the elite schools, you will find about 70% of students report abuse, and about 50 to 60% of students are report abuse in government schools. School climate is very, very related to school belongingness. So unless you have school belongingness, you also find that they are not going to really do well in their academics and various other areas. Student attentiveness is also a very important aspect where it's connected to learning outcomes. And we also have found predictor relationships on SEL in school climate. So we can actually predict what the learning outcomes, the academic learning outcomes are going to be, how much of that would change depending upon how they acquire SEL and school climate. And there are many more findings like that, which are very, very nuanced. These are very large reports. I'm just giving you a very tip of the iceberg. This is my last slide. What is the relevance to EdTech? All the assessments we do are both offline as well as online. On online, we have our test for platform. Children actually take these tests to mobile phones or tablets across India. So we think EdTech is an enabler. Even the other studies I had mentioned about, like the video studies, etc., can be also done on a Zoom platform, etc. So EdTech is definitely an enabler when it comes to assessments and research and training. But digital learning will take time to evolve. We find that software is not so much of an issue, but hardware and internet are definite constraints, at least in India. And there's a huge UNICEF study which was conducted very recently after COVID, which says that when 60% of children have access, and we find that even that could be a slightly over inflated figure, etc. Human interventions are definitely not replaceable by, you definitely can use EdTech as an enabler, but human interventions are not replaceable. Imagine a car accident, and this is a report that came in Fortune magazine actually about Detective Spooner. So for example, there's a car accident and there is an old man and there's a 12-year-old girl, and a robo is the one which is coming to pull them out, and it decides to save the old man, but give up the young girl because the chances of recovery is much more lower for her or something like that. So human emotions are very, very different when it comes to judgments, and machines cannot replace them. Technology by itself cannot solve issues. And we also find, based on all our assessments, impact assessments across the different intervention products, we find where interventions are, SEL interventions are using technology as a tool, or even an offline SEL intervention. We find that a much more granular understanding of the skills, the frameworks, the delineation of that and what comprises it, how long will it take to bring about a change? Is it different for different levels of children, different cultural contexts, different age groups? All of that needs to be researched and thoroughly understood before you can actually bring about a change or a predictable change, etc. So much more research is required in that. And more importantly, EdTech is generally understood across as a cheaper product, but in reality, it is not. So if you have to scale, then how do we figure out how to build it at scale where it's reachable by the low-income groups as well? So these are broadly the points that I have. Thanks, Akanksha. I hope very much.
Thank you so much, Vajanti. And I think in regards to questions around EdTech as an enabler for measurement of SEL, we will definitely come back to that in the Q&A. Thank you very much for that. And now I will hand the floor over to Danika. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. And I'll try to keep my remarks pretty brief. I'll touch on three three main points, also building on what's been said here. Firstly, I'll offer a bit of a maybe slightly broader perspective to contextualize the work of the foundation as it relates to supporting adaptive learning ecosystems and how we think of SEL in that context. And secondly, I'll touch on the role of technology to support SEL and the main priorities we see in that space in terms of research and practice. And finally, talk briefly about what we're actually doing in this space and where we're going as a foundation. So maybe starting with the broader view, a lot of the work of the Jacobs Foundation currently focuses on what we call supporting adaptive learning ecosystems, which means really going beyond the education system. So these are diverse, trustful communities working, learning together, and using evidence-based decision-making, adapting to the unique learning needs and preferences of each child, and providing a diverse range of learning environments and experiences to ensure that every child develops the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, and the values to realize their full learning potential. So in that regard, we actually look at literacy and numeracy as essential, but also 21st century skills, socio-emotional learning, character development, everything we call kind of holistic learning and development. And to develop these capacities, every child needs to benefit from a wide range of learning experiences and environments that are adapted to their unique needs and preferences and scaffolded from birth through childhood all the way up to adolescence and adulthood. And such learning experiences and environments should be provided at home, in school, and beyond, in a system that has the holistic development of all children as its core purpose, and it's designed in such a way. And this obviously requires a detailed understanding and embracing of individual differences in learning and close collaboration between different actors at every level of the system. So one point I wanted to emphasize here is that we look at holistic child development without necessarily itemizing skills. We know from evidence that the socio-emotional side of neurofunctioning and learning and the cognitive side of it are not entirely separate things, and then they're mutually interdependent and connected. Now, coming into our perspective on the role of EdTech, and we really are approaching this question from the point of view of what role can technology play in supporting holistic child development, and more specifically, how can it enable learning ecosystems at the classroom level, but also beyond, to embrace children's individual differences and cater to them more effectively, for example, through things like adaptive learning tools. And specific to that, this means advancing research that helps us better understand a few key questions that I wanted to raise here in this forum. One of these questions is, how can tech enable children to connect with academic content, but also engage with each other more deeply and help students learn SEL skills in that process? How can tech help students direct their own learning experience more effectively and develop increased engagement? And how can it help students work to their strengths and enjoy a more personalized experience in the classroom? And of course, many others here have mentioned the question of measurement. How can technology help assess holistic learning as more of a reflective, formative assessment, so that teachers can use a variety of different tools to better understand how students are doing with holistic skills and overall mindsets? So we definitely see this connection between what we're learning from the learning sciences research, coupled with the flexibility and precision of digital tech, as an opportunity to design learning that is responsive to what we call learner variability or catering to individual differences. And using an EdTech solution, teachers can provide appropriate resources to children so that they can learn what they need to learn at their level. And every child has the opportunity to demonstrate understanding in a class discussion. And then the teacher, of course, is freed up to monitor progress and facilitate that discussion. So EdTech can help learning to be adapted to the individual by adjusting to the strengths and needs of each student. Now moving into more of what are we actually doing to advance this agenda? And one thing I wanted to emphasize here is that we're really very much approaching all of this from the perspective of a research funder, a funder that's very much committed to taking more of an evidence lens and supporting governments, supporting industry and funders to make sure that the EdTech world and the ecosystem is very much driven by the evidence. So there are a couple of things that we're currently supporting and committing to. Firstly, we want to promote the use of evidence as a much more integral part of funding and investment decisions. And what I mean here is that while EdTech use is growing, actually the evidence, when you look at it very objectively, the evidence on efficacy is quite scarce. And commercially successful models rarely have a strong evidence base to prove their impact on learning. The use of evidence in purchasing by governments, funding, but also importantly, investment needs to be made, needs to become a priority if EdTech is really to reach its potential. So this year we invested about 30 million through EdTech venture capital funds to promote the use of evidence in EdTech among investors and companies, and to really push the industry as a whole towards a much more evidence-based commitment. And secondly, one opportunity that we see is to bring robust science into the EdTech product development and design. And here, there is a lot of research, of course, that is being done on EdTech, especially in areas, and we see a lot of promise, such as in areas of personalized learning, but the evidence is not consistently used to inform EdTech design and purchasing decisions. And that, I mean that globally, not just for low and middle income settings, but really looking at places such as the US and Europe. When you look at the biggest companies out there, sometimes the evidence is really lacking. So bridging the divide between science and EdTech tools will be essential in our view, in ensuring that robust science drives how EdTech is developed and used. And to that end, this year, we're actually launching a new university-led international network that will be based out of the University of California, Irvine, that will be bringing together global leaders in computer science, psychology, neuroscience, education, and education tech in pursuit of this goal. So to summarize, and in the interest of time, the view here is that there is great potential for technology, and there's a lot of opportunity to really move beyond itemizing skills and to view tech as one tool that can support holistic learning and holistic development for children. However, we're still lacking evidence across the board for what's really generating the best impact. And in here, we're looking more holistically of how can we support industry, governments, and companies and investors to really create that ecosystem for evidence. So pause here. I know we're running out of time, and I'm very happy to take any questions or expand on any of these points in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Danika, Vajanti, and Elizabeth. Very, very interesting session. I think I'm just going to tie one thread here together and have a question or two for all three of you together. So one thing that's definitely emerged here is that skills are all interconnected. There is a lot of cross-connectivity across implementation, measurement, and skills themselves. So the first question is, how do we see artificial intelligence play a role in measurement, implementation, and scale-up? One for each. Yeah, Vajanti, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I think fundamentally we first need to understand how learning happens in some of these skills. I think research doesn't exist there at all, in the sense that both from the measurement perspective as well as from the learning perspective. Like, when you look at learning sciences, even for maths and science and language, why some children learn, why some children don't learn, and why they are learning at different rates. And these are things that you need to understand even in that space. And when it comes to why certain children learn relationship skills, why, and if so, all of that type of research doesn't exist. So when we don't understand how, of course, neuroscience is, going ahead, and I'm really excited by what Danika shared about the learning sciences work that they're going to be doing with in California. I think that type of research needs to happen. where whether it's neuroscience, whether it's assessments, whether it is pedagogies, intervention players, etc., need to come together to understand how these are acquired. So artificial intelligence happens after we basically even understand how, to some extent, some of these skills are acquired, because artificial intelligence, some amount of basic level of things you need to build in, after which the machine takes over. I'm saying that that understanding needs to be strengthened before we can actually say artificial intelligence will sort of come in and it will conquer us and so on. Therefore, I think it's a long way to go.
Elizabeth, do you want to take this?
It's a little tricky because this is not my specialty area. However, I would put up maybe a little flag of caution on this one. You can probably tell from my presentation that I tend to be much more relationship focused. And I think the people who are going to know the children best are the caring adults in their life who are, sensitively responding to them. And the, a really experienced teacher is in many ways an artist and can understand and integrate the kind of holistic idea of the child as a human individual in a way that our measures can't, and certainly in a way that I think artificial intelligence algorithms really would struggle to do. And I know it's much more resource intensive, but there are ways to allow technology to support teachers and humans to do what they do so well, which is to relate to each other, connect to each other, support one another, that I think don't necessarily require AI evaluations of children.
Danika, you mentioned that you have been funding a large investor ecosystem in tech. And do you see AI being utilized there, and how?
Yes, I just put in the chat actually as part of the work that I mentioned, which is this multi-university network. We also launched something called SELA, the Center for Learning and Living with AI, which really is approaching it from a question of almost, what are the key questions we need to be exploring for a world that needs to learn how to live and, learn with AI and work with AI. So it's a little bit more oriented towards starting to preempt some of the questions that we'll need to face going forward. And this work is really going to be looking at kind of large scale research on different kinds of technologies and the influence that they'll have. And what are the pedagogical innovations in schools that will utilize AI in support of teachers, for example, in marking, grading papers, things like that. How do you not introduce biases into AI? Because I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges going forward, as many have said, of the human bias is not eliminated when you talk about AI. So these are exactly the kind of research questions and areas that SELA is going to be looking at. So we're really excited to see what that research comes up with, and we'll definitely be sharing more, as we think that this is definitely going to be a huge part of our lives going forward, and we need to be proactively thinking about what things do we need to address collectively to make sure that it doesn't take us by surprise.
Absolutely. And the reason I bring up AI, and Elizabeth, also taking into consideration your reservation about everything being relational, I'm completely agreeing with that, particularly in the context of SEL, is that in terms of diagnostics, it could be a very useful tool, not only in terms of measurement of skills, but also in terms of understanding what's really going on. So as an example, what we did several years ago was to try and understand how skills are related to each other. And we did end up using natural language processing to process 1.5 million research articles to find these linkages in the language across that's been used in the research papers, and definitely find, for example, creativity and critical thinking are very strongly linked, and maybe via technology as well. And I could potentially even share some of that. So in terms of that kind of diagnostics and understanding skills, we also have very little understanding of how skills evolve over ages, and how those interactions change over ages. So I think it could prove to be a very useful tool in bringing about that understanding. And last but not the least, in terms of assessments as well. Having spent like a significant chunk of time in developing and assessing at scale, I think we're still fairly behind in thinking about SEL measurement, because we're, for the purposes of implementability, scalability, we're still going with mostly pen and paper assessments, or at the most moving them to a digital version of a similar assessment. But technology now, particularly in this post-pandemic world, provides a huge promise to think about assessments a lot more creatively for skills like creativity. So, so just wanted to kind of put this angle of AI up there. And I think we can have a few more specific questions for you. We have maybe about 5 minutes. I think, so Vajanti, have you really thought about this move from traditional methods of developing assessments for SEL to newer ways? That would be one. If there's been any kind of work going on that front, that would be great to hear.
Yeah. So see, fundamentally, when you build assessments, whether it's formative or summative, the first fundamental thing that we need to understand is that how delineated these skills are from the empirical point of view. So while the theoretical, theory exists, and theory is also like generally not, it may be, brought in by Delphi type of method rather than actual data of how people behave or think or emote, etc. That sort of a thing. So that research needs to go on to a large extent. So we have been doing this work in the future readiness skills, as well as all the battery, the SEL battery, and the various things that you saw. For example, we find that when it comes to ability to understand emotions or regulate emotions, etc., you would find that there are differences between gender, there are differences between age groups, there are differences between different areas. Like, for example, if Jharkhand is a state which is speaking Hindi and Rajasthan is a state that is speaking Hindi, but you would still need to have a different scale to sort of measure at an individual level. So these type of nuances and data and research first needs to be collected. And once that is very, very clear, then whether you are building it as a diagnostic impact assessment or a score for the child, or whether you are doing it as a formative assessment where the teacher is doing it every day, can be done. But more importantly, what I find is that in assessments, when we looked at research across the world, types of assessment tools that exist, most of these tools, 90 to 99% of tools would be what we call as self-reports or, Likert-like scales, which are like aspirational responses. So you have something called as an Hawthorne effect or a sentinel effect, which happens. That means that either I give an answer because I feel I'm observed, or I give an answer because I feel I'm going to be judged. And that necessarily need not be how I will do in life, because, and that could also because your mental image of yourself will be very different from what others are seeing or how you actually behave. So these things are really, it clouds this thing. So it's not, the SEL measurement also has to be absolutely, like when you're asking a question in mathematics and you ask like 2 + 5 = 2, and you're expecting a child to say 7, and if he doesn't say 7, you know what the issue is. And if similarly in an SEL, will you be able to predict and diagnose to that type of specificity where you know that the child is actually going to behave like that? That's why the vignette approach is something that we have adopted in the later studies that we have been doing, and it has been doing pretty well in terms of psychometric data, that empirical data that is coming in, and fit indices and so on. And I think that's the way to go to actually diagnose, where it will be very different from a self-report or an aspirational answer.
Thank you, V.S. Danika, I want to come back to you on what you mentioned about funding this ecosystem of developers of EdTech interventions. Could you talk a bit more about the theory of change, and how do you see the change really happening?
Yeah, of course. So as I mentioned, we're working on 2 different fronts. One is to connect research and practice, and the second one is to connect research into decision-making, meaning purchasing, investment, funding, and so forth. So the theory of change for both of these is that If we can really influence the broader ecosystem of both investment, but also the development of the EdTech tools, the large companies out there that are developing these tools, if we can really incentivize them to really integrate evidence into the development of products, but also in the decisions that they make to fund and to invest in EdTech, then ultimately we'll end up with more impactful tools and products for SEL and beyond, for everything related to how EdTech is being used. And the way that we're doing this is with our foundation capital. Foundations don't typically engage as VC funders. They don't engage with large EdTech companies in that way. So we're working with like-minded foundations who are supporting the ecosystem in similar ways to us to actually help kind of call for more evidence globally, because we think that this is very much needed globally in terms of EdTech, and we hope that that will push the industry and the investment world into thinking more about even EdTech standards. We have those for medicines. You wouldn't walk into a pharmacy thinking you are going to get stuff that's harmful for you, but we have nothing of that kind at scale for EdTech, and parents and consumers more generally lack that understanding of what's really working, because things are so complex and so difficult to understand that they don't really have access to that in a really kind of meaningful way. So that's what we're trying to do here. And we hope that many others will join that and will ultimately be able to have a few years from now a different conversation. Hopefully that is really informed by a lot more evidence.
Thank you. I would like to open the floor to all of the panelists who are here. If there's any concluding remarks, last couple of minutes, anything you might like to add to this discussion, which has been really interesting, and it feels like it's only just the start of this discussion on socio-emotional learning and education and technology. So I'd just like to invite everyone if you have anything to add here. Yes, Vajanti.
Yeah, so I really like Donika's point of where most of the programs are based on stuff which are like weak in terms of being proven empirically. So a lot of research is needed even in understanding the skill, but at the same time, even a lot of research is needed in figuring out how to build great assessment tools. Because, assessments, as I said, are like very complex and different. So how do you build a formative tool? How do you build a summative tool? How do you build a sort of a diagnostic impact tool? And if so, for example, very simple things like, you may say that collaboration is different from conflict, but is it really different or not? Things like that. For example, how is critical thinking different from problem solving? Because it's so delineated that you can actually measure them. Or when you ask them a question on problem solving, because critical thinking is integral part of problem solving. So what is the underlying ability that the child is displaying when he's answering a question related to that? So a lot of research needs to happen in this space. In the academic space, it happened from 1850s onwards, and 100 years of research happened before proper scientific ways of measurement evolved in that space. But in the SEL space, it's very, very nascent, and people need to understand that such research needs to be supported as well as encouraged, so that people adopt to measurement, as well as measurement agencies are also supported to build better and better tools, so on.
Thank you. Oh, yes, Elizabeth.
I just wanted to add kind of a final thought about culture and how important culture is when we talk about both social and emotional skills, whether that's comprehension or expression. And I think that's important both on the side of thinking about like community-driven systems change. Like what does a community want? What does it look like in a community for children and groups to thrive? And really trying to understand what the kind of needs-based approach would be. but also really thinking about how that affects measurement, because many of our social and emotional measures that are being developed are often developed in the West, and they don't reflect the kinds of cultural kind of standards for interacting and collaborating and expressing emotion and interpreting emotion and all of that that are quite diverse around the world. Of course, there are universals, but there's a lot of diversity too. So I just wanted to add that in also, that we really need to pay very close attention both to the kind of idea of like contextualizing and what that really means when it comes to measuring, and also program design, and whether we want to contextualize or whether we really want to start at the heart of the communities and work up from there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Elizabeth. Actually, in fact, that was going to be sort of my wrap up kind of comments. Completely agree. We have been doing some work on EdTech and using systems thinking and systems approaches. And the applicability of these approaches to complex subjects like socio-emotional learning is absolutely visible. Given that skills are interconnected, given that design of these interventions requires a whole host of factors that are relational, as you said. And also then we bring in the angles of various kinds of stakeholders, assessments, measurements, and all of that. So I think one of the approaches that can tie all of this in together is thinking not anymore in a linear fashion, but in a much more networked fashion. And thinking of everything as being interconnected. So I think with that, we're exactly at 5 p.m. And I would really like to thank all of the panelists and participants who have been part of this discussion. We would love to keep this conversation going and potentially maybe reach out if anyone is interested in working with us or writing some blog posts, which we will be doing over the next couple of weeks. So we look forward to hearing from you and to keep the conversation going. Thank you very much to everyone again. I would also like to thank the team at the Edtech Hub who has been really supportive in setting this up. So Jennifer, Jacques, Jill, Laila, Namrata, Christina, Asma, and Susan Nikolai. And thank you very much, everyone, for being here.